What I found was very interesting in here is you gave a history of different people that you definitely want to avoid. You talked about Darwin, Huxley, Freud, Dewey, Sanger, and you also mentioned another person that people aren't necessarily familiar with, Alfred Kinsey. Tell us a little bit about this shady character and how he has influenced our culture so that we are where we are today.
Thank you, Jeff. And as you mentioned, I started this whole journey because I was a sex educator. I was told that parents aren't doing their job, so I needed to go into the schools and do it for them. So as the school nurse, I was trained to go into the schools and talk to kids about sex. They said, there's a lie out there that you're going to hear, that if you talk to kids about sex, they're going to go out and do it, and that's simply not true. So I did that for 5 years very diligently, and then my husband and I were blessed with our first child. So I still wanted to work for the health department where I was working out of, but I wanted to work part-time. The only part-time job available was working in the venereal disease HIV clinic, as God would have it. So over the next 8 years, I actually got to see the fruit of my labor. And I saw things getting progressively worse, not better, which challenged me to go, wait a minute, the authorities who educated me told me the complete opposite. So I'm going to get down to the root of the problem here. What the heck is going on? When did sex education come into this country? Have we always done it in our schools? Who developed it and what was the intent behind it? And if you are going to look at sex education, you have to look at a man by the name of Alfred Kinsey. Revolutions, they take revolutionaries years of pre-planning. So I know we think of the sexual revolution really occurring in the 1960s, but back it up 100 years. The pre-planning had to go into place before it could go to fruition. So there was this revolutionary that was used, Alfred Kinsey. He went to Harvard University, where already they were teaching, by the late 1800s, they were teaching that law was no longer fixed, as in the Ten Commandments, but rather it was evolving. So he embraced Darwin, walked away from his faith, embraced Darwin, and studied the sexual behavior of the gall wasp. So he ended up at Indiana University as a professor and teacher there, and he also was a researcher. He decided to go further than what Freud had done. He wanted to do sex studies. So he declared that we are much more sexual than we really are indicating. He claimed to have scientifically proven that we're all sexual animals, that rape is a myth, that infants could have sex with adults and there is no harm in that. But when you look closely at his data, and for some of you who walked past my table out there, you saw table 34, which is the data he collected from pedophiles who rape children. And from that, he concluded that children are sexual from birth. Well, how does he know that an infant is having an orgasm? If they're crying, fainting, shrieking, fighting away the partner. He calls that the partner, not the perpetrator. So he went into the prisons and he sought out the most sexually deviant criminals, they were in there for sex crimes. He interviewed them and said, this is the typical sexual behavior of the American male. Now, in the late 30s and 40s, when he was doing his studies, where were the American men? They were over there. And believe it or not, we were a much more modest society, and we would have been offended and not even answered some of the questions that Kinsey was asking. He interviewed prostitutes if they lived with a woman, which was against the law back then. If they lived with a woman for more than a year, then he declared this was the typical sexual behavior of the American female. So clearly this was not objective data, but rather this was subjective data. But unfortunately, he was funded by the wealthy elite in our country, the Rockefeller Foundation, who also funded Margaret Sanger. And his science was used to shift how we all looked at life and human sexuality. I don't care if you're in the field of law, medicine, education, even the ministry. Every institution in America has been affected by Kinsey's science and infiltrated. So he launched, the Kinsey Institute is still at Indiana University today. They launched an organization called SIECUS in 1964, which is the Sex Information Education Council of the United States. It was first headed up by Dr. Mary Calderon from Planned Parenthood and funded by Hugh Hefner. So brilliant marketing plan to go in and talk to kids about sex. You can get a lot of customers that way. So as I said, they told us that we were going to decrease the pregnancy and the STD rates. But what have we seen since 1964? We have seen STDs, sexually transmitted disease, at an all-time high in our young people. We see extreme depression and suicide related to sexual issues. And we are falling apart as a society. So he was a bad character.
In 1945, right after the Second World War, a sexual manifesto was written. We, the United States, held a scientist, the greatest scientist of the decade in the 40s and 50s. We just about gave him a Nobel Peace Prize. Two of our presidents said he's the greatest American alive. His name was Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey wrote the Sexual Manifesto for the youth, for the sexualization of the world's youth. Everything we know about sex today, everywhere you are, was written by Kinsey, an American, okay? He made Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner was a virgin first year in college. He went to Hugh, he said, "You're my prodigy, we're gonna bring this thing in called Playboy." Everything we do today was written by Kinsey. So here's what happened 5.5 years ago, and we track this globally, because I like to fight the enemy on their territory. I don't believe they need to come into my house. I don't wait until they come here. So this is what happened. And this is fact. And if this ruffles your feathers, then so be it. The World Health Organization took Kinsey's document and wrote a sexual manifesto of today for the world's children. A proposition to this is how to treat children with sex for the world. They brought in a couple friends. They brought in UNESCO, which is an arm of the United Nations. They brought in SICUS, which is the overarching governing body in the United States for all curriculum. And then they brought in one more friend to finalize this curriculum, the International Planned Parenthood Foundation. Okay? Those 5 entities wrote the new sexual manifesto based on Kinsey's work. Now, Kinsey was an adult, 42 at the time, that experimented orgasm on 6-week-old boys, 10-year-old boys, 15-year-old boys. And he classified rejection of sexual orgasm as ecstasy. So when the baby cried, he said that's a form of ecstasy. Every pedophile today, Kinsey is their hero. He's their champion. Do you know that we've not had a single mass murder in American history? Not one. Whether name the names, whether it's Bundy or whoever, that was not a porn addict. They're all porn addicts. They're all pedophiles. And I want to explain to you how this works. So they write this manifesto. They always take it to Africa first. We saw it. They went to Kenya. They tested this curriculum that they wrote in Kenya. They were successful. They completely compromised children. They took it to Europe. And then they literally looked for one suitor. They looked for one suitor in the United States. This is fact. That said, I'll be the first to employ and bring in that manifesto as a curriculum into the United States. And Gavin Newsom raised his hand. It's a fact. Gavin Newsom signed the Comprehensive Sex Ed curriculum into law by executive order without the State Board of Education of California getting a vote. We're currently helping the State Board of Education in California fight against Newsom, because they did not get to vote. Today in California, comprehensive sex ed is the law. If your child is in a public school, that child's taught comprehensive sex ed. From what age, Yaku? From kindergarten.
Yep.